Hi everyone, welcome to our last session of the day on the EOSC Interoperability Framework and the road towards that interoperability framework. If you're just joining now, thanks for tuning in. If you've been here since this morning, then thank you for coming along on this very long marathon event with us. Other than most of the sessions today, we'll only have one speaker for this one, which is Michelle Williams. Michelle is a product manager at the GÉANT Association specializing in trust and identity products, and she is participating in the EOSC future activities on interoperability. So exactly the right woman for this presentation. Before Michelle gets started, there's just a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you that joined earlier, as you know, we're collecting your feedback via Slido. So you can just scan this code or join at slido.com, and we'll again post the relevant information in the chat as well. So without further ado, Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Katrien. So good afternoon, everybody. So today I'll be talking to you about the EOSC Interoperability Framework, explaining more about the concept, why it's important, how it's relevant for providers, and how it will manifest initially, before finishing with a description of its proposed governance. I think everyone here understands that the primary objective of the EOSC is to provide a federated and open multidisciplinary environment where users can publish, find and reuse data, tools and services. But this objective brings many challenges from a technical perspective. Many of these challenges are being tackled by a wide range of projects and initiatives, and much progress has been made in the verification of data and the discovery and reusability of results. But when it comes to composing workflows or interoperating across communities, more challenges arise. The EOSC Executive Board Working Groups on FAIR and Architecture came together to produce the EOSC Interoperability Framework report. It positions the concept in terms of 4 layers of interoperability: technical, semantic, organisational and legal, and describes the minimum requirements and recommendations for the EOSC Interoperability Framework in concise terms that articulate the gaps that need to be filled and the problems that need to be solved. The FAIR and Architecture working groups collectively recommended that the EOSC Interoperability Framework should be a generic framework that can be used by all of the entities participating in the deployment and development of EOSC, providing a common understanding of the requirements, challenges and recommendations that they should take into account, as well as a general set of principles on how these recommendations may be addressed. The EOSC Future project has been working towards these recommendations, and in December we completed deliverable 3.2a that proposed the approach to be taken. This is a continuance of the principles described in the working group's report and begins to offer tangible steps to realise the framework. It's proposed that the EOSC formally recognises existing community interoperability guidelines and makes it possible for resources to signal their compliance to such guidelines. It discusses the differing types of interoperability between community and EOSC core services and proposes a governance framework for interoperability. As interoperability itself is a loaded term, the project's technical coordination is vital that we consult with the community at large to ensure that what's recommended offers value to stakeholders and that the objectives of this activity are clear. And so the Task Leads of Work Package 3 launched a widely publicised consultation on the 25th of March with a 90-minute webinar that describes case studies and offered more detail on the topic and gave the opportunity for participants to pose questions to the panel. We'd encourage you to watch the recording of the webinar if you have time, because it's very informative. The consultation closed on Friday, the 15th of April, and we can now accelerate the work towards the implementation phase. Additional to this background work concerning the framework itself, guidelines that facilitate interoperability with EOSC core services, such as those described in the sessions earlier today, are being produced, and there's a number of working groups undertaking activities to explore and define topics that will also improve interoperability. For example, the Compute Continuum Working Group is working on a new metadata schema specifically for compute, which can be used with the EOSC resource profiles. And another group's defining a research publishing framework to enable the services of research infrastructures to seamlessly integrate repository deposition workflows in the context of EOSC. Okay, so that's what we've done so far, and we understand that it feels like it's taking a long time to achieve, but we're looking to build consensus that will deliver lasting results, and we're keen to take the necessary time to do that. I think that everyone here would agree that interoperability as a concept is important, but now I'd like to explain why we feel that an interoperability framework for EOSC is important. EOSC is a growing federation of data and services, but it's vital that we facilitate interoperability if it's to add maximum value to users. We would like users to go beyond the discovery of a resource to the ability to access it or use it in a workflow with as little friction as we can manage collectively. Interoperability is more than just utilising a specific standard. Using a particular standard that's supported by a service doesn't guarantee interoperability. Multiple interoperability guidelines exist already within communities, but how's a provider to know which standards to use in which cross-domain scenario? And how's a provider to know how to interoperate with the EOSC core itself? In these cases, we need to provide information to providers and users in a structured and trusted manner. This leads on to how we define the EOSC Interoperability Framework. It's a set of guidelines that promote the utilisation of community best practices within the EOSC. It's the governance that allows stakeholders to propose EOSC guidelines into that framework and to manage its oversight. And it's the tools that enable it, such as the EOSC Interoperability Registry. We talk about guidelines a lot, but in this case, we're using it in its broadest sense. That is, a guideline in this context means a set of recommendations advising use of particular formats, metadata, protocols, APIs, standards, and so on. Its objective is to help users and resource owners to understand what they need to export or what guidelines they should follow in order to expose data and services for the purposes of interoperability. The framework is for providers that operate resources, facilities, catalogues, and so on, and for users that would like to ensure that their products can interoperate with others. If a provider or a user is unsure of which standards to work towards for the purposes of interoperability, we should be able to help them to understand what's available and what best practice recommendations are out there. The guidelines would be applicable across communities, such as the Infra EOSC 07 projects, cluster projects, regional projects, and so on and so forth. To illustrate the point further, in this slide, the pieces of the puzzle represent the various resources and their interfaces made available to the EOSC by providers, communities, and so on. It's not currently possible for users to easily assess whether their research products or services are compatible with those already onboarded, or how they should prepare their data with a view to being compatible with another resource in another community. In its simplest form, interoperability is currently achieved by bilateral discussion and point-to-point technical integration that would need to be repeated when the next user of the service comes along with the same requirement, and that the next user and the next user and so on. Now, whilst we might not be able to reduce the complexity of that landscape, nor perhaps should we believe that we will be able to influence more interoperability by promoting the adoption of common standards and interfaces, and by bringing to the surface the standards and interfaces that are used or needed by resources. We don't expect to create new standards or to become a standardization body, but instead we'll encourage adoption of existing community best practices. As such, providers will be given the capability to indicate in the EOSC resource catalogue which interfaces, APIs, standards, etc. its services and research products support. This could give way to removing friction from interoperation and moving towards composable workflows within the EOSC. We realise that there are many different types of interoperability, each with different challenges. We're not attempting to solve everything. In fact, we can't solve everything, but narrowing our focus on specific areas will help us to deliver more value as time goes on. We're currently focusing on interoperability for the EOSC core services and on creating a facility for providers to signal compliance to community best practice within their resource descriptions. As well as the differing types of interoperability, I mentioned earlier that the interoperability can be described in terms of 4 layers: technical, semantic, organisation and legal. Well, initially we're focusing on technical interoperability, but we should keep in mind that perhaps this crosses into semantic interoperability when we talk about metadata guidelines. Here we illustrate aspects of how the interoperability framework will be relevant to providers. In this example, we see a couple of different types of interoperability across communities and with an EOSC core service. At the moment, it's possible to use free text in a resource profile to describe standards that are used. Now, this is good information for the user to have, but citing a standard doesn't help the user to understand about interoperability. The interoperability framework will build upon that to ensure that providers can specify exactly the interoperability guidelines that apply to its resources. So here we see that a data transfer service, for example, is onboarded to the resource catalogue so that it's discoverable. And it will be possible for providers to reference registered interoperability guidelines as part of the service description, or the resource description, thereby signalling that resources that work to the same guidelines can interoperate. It's envisaged that users will be able to search and filter using this new parameter. And in the future, it's also envisaged that it will be possible to use this to drive more complex technical interoperability, such as checking metadata or composing services into new workflows. In the example on this slide, the service is also part of a community AAI that's available to the EOSC AAI. And users will be able to log in and access the service using their institutional credentials as a result. A further example of interoperability is shown here, where the provider has decided to integrate the service with the EOSC help desk using the EOSC core interoperability guidelines that provide the necessary information and APIs to make that integration possible. And note also that the EOSC core services are also connected to the EOSC infrastructure proxy in this case. A key part of the EOSC interoperability framework is to provide a mechanism for enabling the links between services, resources, and data products, and the interoperability guidelines that allow those resources to interoperate with others. There needs to be a place in which to collect and curate interoperability guidelines, and a registry will be introduced to support that. This will allow providers to tag resources with the relevant interoperability information, and this in turn will allow users to discover resources on the basis of their interoperability capabilities. For example, a user would like to find a data transfer service that supports a particular type of metadata or API, and it will ultimately be possible to perform this search using the data that the provider has onboarded. The registry will be a necessary part of the process that creates a supporting structure that will allow the governing body to record each identified or proposed EOSC interoperability guideline based on an agreed profile of attributes. It will become a public library of accepted guidelines and a de facto EOSC knowledge base. We'll begin to populate the EOSC interoperability registry using the output of the EOSC Hub, EOSC Enhance, ARC and OpenAir projects, just to name a few. And the main standards and interfaces as a starting point for EOSC Future documents available on the EOSC Future Wiki for anyone who would like to review that. This starting point acts as a fast track for the adoption and ratification of well-known guidelines and interfaces to the EOSC, and resource providers will be able to reference the appropriate interoperability guidelines in their own services and research product descriptions when the registry is finalised. A process to propose new guidelines for the EOSC interoperability registry has been designed, and when launched, this will help to create a rich database of capabilities. It's thought that this would also help to identify gaps that would require more targeted activity. This registry is also necessary in order to support and formalise the acceptance process, making it possible to signal when the governance forum has has ratified or registered a guideline that has been presented to become a formally recognised EOSC interoperability guideline. To ensure that the EOSC interoperability framework is operated with fairness and transparency, we need effective and strong governance. The proposed model comprises a governing body that oversees the process of ratifying guidelines to the framework. It will leverage EOSC and community communication channels to announce newly adopted guidelines to the research community at large. The EOSC Interoperability Framework seeks to address interoperability needs in such a way that recognises existing community and discipline-specific interoperability frameworks without attempting to overrule or recreate established best practices and guidelines. And it really won't attempt to reinvent certification models such as ISO. We'll populate the framework with common terms of reference with a goal to reduce the need for bilateral discussions and to avoid unnecessary development of overlapping guidelines. So here the EOSC Interoperability Framework will be overseen by these governing bodies that aim to perform an overarching and independent role that will assess requests for inclusion into the framework against a minimum set of requirements. The two levels of governance are inspired by other governance structures in our environment, where the area chairs perform initial assessments of the proposed guidelines against minimum requirements, such as maturity, uptake, impact, presence of guardianship, etc. And that is, rather than writing the guidelines themselves, the chairs will curate proposed guidelines into the framework. The group's function will be to make recommendations to the advisory board as to the guidelines that should be included in the framework, and will be supported by an editorial board of subject matter experts in reviewing the proposals. We intend to begin recruiting this editorial board soon. For the duration of the EOSC Future project, the function of the area chairs will be performed by the EOSC Future Work Package 3 leads, who will call in thematic experts to help with the review process as needed. The advisory board will be responsible for overseeing the framework as a whole, endorsing the recommendations made by the area chairs and making sure that the framework itself is fit for purpose. For the duration of the project, this role will be performed by the EOSC Future Technical Coordination Board. The governance will also oversee the creation of the public registry, the agreement of the taxonomy for the data model to be used for lightweight and standardised descriptions of each guideline, and for the communication of the outcome of each proposal process. Charters are in late draft for both forums and will be made publicly available subsequent to a round of iteration in response to feedback collected during the recent consultation process. Part of the activity will be to develop in consult association and other key stakeholders a permanent governing body that will manage the framework beyond the future project. And a number of options will be put forward, one being the EOSC Association performing this role. The process and data model needs to be sufficiently detailed in order, but also lightweight in order to avoid creating overhead. So we're keen to try to achieve the correct balance. But so far, we've defined a process of proposal, consultation and ratification of guidelines proposed for inclusion in the framework, and a form that would be used when proposing the inclusion of a new guideline. These are all part of the recent consultation, and we hope to publish both shortly. This means that when the governance forums have been chartered, we'll be ready to proceed to the next stages. So the next steps for the implementation of the framework are to conclude the analysis of the consultation responses firstly. That consultation closed on the 15th of April, as I said before, and we'll build the feedback into the final versions of the proposal process, governance model and implementation plan before moving forward. We're already almost ready to confirm the charters for the advisory board and area chairs, and we'll publish them on the EOSC Future Wiki as soon as they're complete. And at that point, we should also be ready to launch the governance process itself. We'll design or commence design and implementation of the interoperability registry. We have some options for that already, which will allow us to populate it with the proposed guidelines and the starting point, as I mentioned earlier on. So even though the consultation is now closed, any feedback is welcomed. But I believe that we now have some time for Q&A. So I'll hand back to the hosts for today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Michelle, for this presentation. Going through Slido, I see that we have 2 questions. The one that we will start with is one that was actually already asked in the previous session, but which seemed more fitting for this one, which is whether there is a list of use cases that EOSC interoperability guidelines aims to enable, or that can be used to assess interoperability across providers. I don't know, Michelle, whether you can speak to that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So we described a number of exemplary use cases in our webinar. And again, hopefully we'll be able to share the link to then give you the opportunity to watch that back. I think it's always quite difficult for this task because we're looking to achieve such a broad goal across such a large landscape. And what we find is that we describe a use case and that resonates with some members of the community and not with others. And so what we tend to do is try to describe the concept and some very high level examples to bring that concept to life. So I think it's probably for some more detailed descriptions of those use cases, I'd recommend going back to that webinar. And I think you'll find those sort of quite interesting.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michelle. I hope that clarifies it, Ulmar. Then a question that has gotten some upvotes is how new starting points can be added or be included on that wiki page. For instance, the fair sharing standards, the fair sharing 1590 standards. Is that something that you know, Michelle?
Yes, so the idea of the starting point was when we were trying to put some flesh around the original concept of the interoperability framework's bones, as it were. And I think this was trying to exemplify the types of guidelines and standards that we would be looking to include. Now, you mentioned 1590 standards. It's a lot to be trying to register, and actually you could argue what's the value of trying to re-register them when they're already available in fair sharing. So the idea is that if there are new or sort of overarching guidelines that are proposed or in existence at communities, there will be that proposal process to be able to then propose new standards to be utilised as an EOSC guideline, or recognised as an EOSC guideline, so to speak. When it comes down to specific standards, we have to take a decision on exactly to what level of granularity we would go. So actually, that's a really good example of just a conversation I was having with the rest of the Work Package 3 team earlier on today.
Okay, I hope that clarifies. 1590 standards does seem like quite a bit. Then there's one more question. So if anyone else has a question, feel free to add them, because we do have some time left if you want to. That is, which platform or technology will be used for the interoperability register? Has that been decided?
We have a couple of options. There are existing registries that we could potentially leverage rather than developing our own. But there is also, we have the option to extend the EOSC providers component. So one would argue that a provider would already have its own provider profile registered. If there was, if it was the guardian of a particular guideline, why not put it in the nature of profile to describe the interoperability guideline that provider is proposing. So I think, again, these are part of the key decisions that we'll take over the next couple of, the next few weeks, really. So I think that's a bit of a non-committal answer. If there are suggestions, then please come forward, because we'd happily consider those in the analysis.
Okay, maybe can you put in the chat, Michelle, how people can best get in touch with you if they have, if they want to get involved? Or
yes, I can share my email address, but
or an administrative email address if you're collecting that somewhere.
So we have a work package 3 mailing list. There is no specific mailing list for suggestions for the interoperability framework.
Then I think people can always email info@eoscfuture.eu as well. Then we can forward that to the right person, which will be Michelle or one of her colleagues, so that way you can get in touch with us as well. And a few extra questions have been added. Someone asks, how much of the detail you've presented here, Michelle, would providers need to get involved with? For instance, if a university wants to make an institutional repository available through EOSC, would they really need to be involved in the details of that interoperability framework?
I think it depends on. So I think in this context, it seems to me that the repository is probably more of a resource that would be onboarded. And it depends on the role of the university. If the university itself is the provider, then it's responsible for registering its own resources. I'm not sure. From the tone of the question, I get the impression that the university isn't the provider in this particular example.
Yeah, maybe the person who asked that question, you can clarify if you want, so you can unmute yourself if you want to. Maybe something to point out though is that what we've presented here is that interoperability framework, and Michelle and her colleagues have done a consultation on that and on what the interoperability framework that they've proposed would look like. That doesn't mean that if you want to make something available through EOSC, that automatically you will have to get involved in these discussions about interoperability. The discussions will have, I think, will have an effect on your resource in the sense that it may be interoperable or it may be not, depending on that framework. But it's not the case that to provide something through EOSC, you will need to get involved in all of these discussions or consultations if you don't want to. What you will need to do when you onboard something, whatever that is to fill in descriptions and quite elaborate descriptions of the resource that you're making available to make sure that it is findable, and to see whether it's interoperable. It needs to meet those EOSC profiles as well. So that is something that you would need to do, but you would not need to get involved in the sort of very complex discussions about that interoperability, which isn't to say that you can't get involved if you want to.
Indeed.
Then let's see which other questions have been added. Oh, yeah, someone noted that the consultation was only on the governance and it was not possible to comment on all elements of this proposal. I think that is true. That was specifically the consultation. But I think, Michelle, that usually we're quite open to feedback on other parts as well. It's just that this consultation had a very specific focus, right?
Very much so, yes. I think what we were trying to do is, it is such a large piece of work that to try to consult on absolutely everything all at once just, results in confusion, really. So what we wanted to do was make sure that we've got the governance in place first, because the governance will help us to proceed with the definition of the more granular parts of the process, the concept, the technology, and so on. Yeah, so that was our main reason, but I'm very much open to more feedback.
Okay, then there's another question, which is someone saying, what will you do if an interoperability recommendation already exists in the interoperability registry that you're developing, and someone else recommends something similar to register?
Okay. Yeah, again, this is a good question. So typically it would be the guardian or maintainer of the guideline itself that would be making the recommendation. But of course, it may be that actually somebody that is, or a community that has utilised that guideline has found it so useful that they feel that it should be a recommendation to the EOSC too. In this context, well, the idea behind our registry is it gives us the opportunity to make sure that we're aware of what's being recommended. We're able to potentially identify any overlap, and I think the overlap would need to be dealt with in terms of, firstly, this editorial board and the area chairs having identified and discussed it amongst themselves. It may be that we discuss with the maintainers of the guideline and the proposers. I think that it can be a robotic automated process in this case. I think it's all.
Have we lost you, Michelle, or?
I'm still here.
Okay, sorry. I thought you were gone mid-sentence, but maybe I just misheard. Might also be me.
If the last word you heard was collaboration, then I think we're good.
I think it's on my side. I was worried that we've lost you, which would also mean that the session had ended by default because I can't answer these questions. That said, I don't think we've. No, we do have a new question. Someone says that because sometimes the devil is in the details. Would it make sense to expand on or explore generic use cases in real situations with existing potential providers? I don't know whether that's something that you could give some input on, Michelle.
Yeah, very much so. I think whilst I said that sort of illustrative use cases and examples are somewhat helpful, I think it's also vital that we make sure that we're focusing on the reality of the situation. And you're right, the devil is in the detail. If we talk too much at a high level, then we will never encounter the real challenges. So it certainly does make sense to expand on those use cases for real situations. And as I said, I think there are some examples around data transfer in particular that I think that my colleagues in, I forget which, are working on. I think if there are things that you specifically have in mind, I'd be 100% happy to hear more about those ideas, and you'd be welcome to come to one of our meetings to help us discuss further.
Yeah, because I noticed that use cases is something that keeps coming back in several sessions. I think if you go to eospportal.eu, you'll notice in the top menu there that we've actually collected use cases. So they're under one navigational element in the top menu. So in the menu at the top of the page, I'm just posting the link in the chat. And we're adding use cases there. So we've started adding use cases there, I think, about one a week, one every 2 weeks for the coming months, let's say until the summer holidays. We are trying to add more use cases there. And I think EOSC Future and several other projects also are running use cases, both use cases in terms of providers and the onboarding process and making things interoperable, but also use cases with researchers or research organizations really starting to use the things in EOSC and trialing how things work. And sort of the updates on that you'll be able to find on the EOSC portal in that use cases section.
Perhaps also maybe people are familiar with the zoom in, zoom out concept. So I think looking at specific use cases, that aligns to the zoom in approach. So we can keep on looking to make sure that the general principles that we're working towards actually do meet real life examples. Zoom out is also where we then have to make sure that we're not then channeling down little rabbit holes and finding ourselves that in a position where we've met really well a couple of use cases, but actually the wider strategy is not met. So I think we're always having to, as I said, zoom in and zoom out to make sure that we are following the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. And I think something else that might be worth pointing out is if you say, well, I actually have a use case that trial something, or something where I think this is ready to be onboarded in EOSC, but there might be some extra requirements needed. Something that is interesting to maybe have a look at is the early adopters programs that EOSC Future is running. I'm not exactly sure of the date to submit a proposal. That I think it's 15th of May, but it will be a rolling call, so it will be opened again later on. So if you say, actually, I have an idea for a use case, then you could propose it there. Then let me do a final check of Slido to see whether any new questions have been posted, but I don't think
doing that as well. I think we're also working in collaboration with the work package that's focusing on science projects. So we are also receiving lots of good feedback and input from the scientific community.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's we'd kind of design that into the project as well. But you know, the more use cases in some ways, the better, because we can sense check the direction.
Yeah, I think so. As Michelle says, we are working very closely with scientific communities, and that's built into the EOSC Future project, where we have 10 use cases and now a few smaller ones that we're working on as well with science clusters, trialing new things, that both them using EOSC, but at the same time moving forward what the platform can do. And then this call is really just for smaller types of use cases where you really want to trial something small, but might need some extra help on that. I didn't see any new questions. If there's a final question that you want to ask, now is the time. If not, I think we'll about start wrapping up.
I think just while we're waiting, there's also the opportunity, as well as the early adopters program, we have an opportunity in Work Package 3 for the creation of working groups that look at solving particular challenges as well. So the process for suggesting new chartered working groups was opened in September last year. As I mentioned earlier on, we have probably 3 or 4 that are running at the moment, but we'd be more than happy to receive any suggestions to actually operate that as a working group too.
Yeah, so I think it should be clear there's plenty of ways to get involved. I don't have the link handy, Michelle, for where people can propose a working group. So if you have that, maybe you can post that in the chat as well. Then in the meantime, let's try to start wrapping up. And there's a few things I want to point out. The main one from my part is that this is a session that we will be, that this is an event that will continue tomorrow and the day after. And in the coming days, we'll have sessions specifically for different target groups. So there will be a session specifically for libraries, for repositories, for EU research projects, for NHPC centers tomorrow. In each of those, you'll get more information on how these groups can contribute to EOSC. So whether you're a library, whether you work at a library yourself, or whether you act as an intermediary, that I think will be interesting for you. If you're interested in use cases, in all of these sessions, or nearly all of these sessions, there will be use cases on what people are right now providing through the platform and what they are getting out of that. Those 4 sessions are tomorrow morning. Then in the afternoon, you can join for a training session, a longer training session on how you can onboard your services to the EOSC portal. And that is really a walkthrough of all the different steps you need to take and what those steps contribute. So why those steps can be interesting for you. Then the day after tomorrow, on the 28th of April, we'll have 3 more audience-specific presentations, one in the morning for science clusters and research infras, afterwards EOSC specifically for commercial providers. So that's interesting, I think, if you are from an SME or you want to see how SMEs and other organizations can get involved in EOSC. and then a final one on national infras as EOSC providers. And if you didn't register for the sessions, but you still want to, that you can do so at this link. If you say, well, actually, I'm not specifically looking for more information for providers, but I am interested in other types of events, then this is what we have on the menu for the coming months. So next week, there will be 2 EOSC policy events in Strasbourg, but they will also be live streamed online. There is one policy event is more high level on the 3rd, and then the 4th, the day after, there will be more of a workshop, joint workshop with different EOSC projects at a national level as well. So you can still register for those at the link that I've put in the chat now, which is EOSC Future/events. Next week as well, on the same day as a high-level policy event, if you say, well, the high-level policy is not really what I'm into, but I want really very specific things, then you can join our Ask Me Anything session on aggregators. The Ask Me Anything sessions are sessions that we run each month, and each month in those sessions we take a look at a specific type of resource that is available in the EOSC catalog and marketplace. And this month that's data and search aggregators. Maybe as an aside to that, if you say, oh, aggregate is not my thing, but I am interested in data storage or compute, then you can also have a look at the previous sessions. All of those have been recorded, and those recordings are also available. If you go to EOSC Future/events and you scroll down the page, you'll see the past events, and on those event pages, you'll always find the recordings of each session of that event. Then on the 25th of May, there's the trainer session on preparing training materials for EOSC, so you can join that as well. I think that the number of registrations is limited for that one, just because for training, the group can't be too big. 7th of June, we have another Ask Me Anything session, this time on HPC centers and their role in EOSC. We have a session on that tomorrow as well from the provider point of view. This one is more from a user point of view and just giving an idea of HPC, which is kind of difficult to integrate within EOSC, how that is looking and what the roadmap for that would be. And then very far into the future, but already worth mentioning now, I think that is that from the 14th to the 17th of November, we will be organizing the EOSC Symposium. That will be in person, but it will also be online, and that's really 3 whole days of everything EOSC. So it will give updates on projects. There will be governance discussions there as well. So it's, I think, the whole updates on EOSC, the EOSC platform and where it's at. So for all of those, you can register at eoscfuture.eu/events, and you can rewatch the recordings as well there, as I said. That also includes the recordings to this event. So if you want to rewatch or you want to send the recordings to someone, we aim to have all of them available by the end of the week. So I have my colleague here who is ready for as soon as this session ends, she will try to download it and edit it so that we can try to make that available for you by tomorrow. And then we aim to do the same in the coming days. Then that's it from me. I don't know whether there's any last remarks from any of my colleagues from EOSC Future that might still be in the chat. If not, I very much want to thank you for tuning in today, and I want to thank Michelle for this final presentation of the day, and I hope to see many of you again in the coming days.